Cold open noon to 1:30. Helen sat alone in her kitchen and said something she'd never said out loud before. I wonder if I did all right. The words hung in the air, like steam from her tea. No one was there to answer. Not anymore. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when the television is off, the dishes are done, and the day has finally given up its noise. Outside, the streetlights hummed softly. Inside, the old clock above the fridge ticked in that familiar, comforting way. It had ticked for 50 years. This kitchen had seen almost every version of her. And that night, in that ordinary kitchen, something extraordinary was about to happen. But Helen didn't know that yet. She was only trying to make a cup of tea. The question, 1:30 to 8. Helen switched on the small lamp in the corner. Not the bright ceiling light, just the one with the slightly crooked shade, the one that made the room feel smaller, warmer, almost like the kitchen itself was wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. She filled the kettle at the sink. The tap made that little stuttering sound, the same sound that used to wake the baby 30 years ago when she'd sneak down for midnight bottles. She'd cursed that tap back then, standing barefoot on cold linoleum with the screaming infant upstairs. She missed those nights now. Funny how that works. Steam rose. The kettle began to murmur. Helen leaned against the counter and looked around her. The scratched wooden table, where her children had done their homework, argued about who got the last cookie, and eventually stopped coming home for dinner. The same chairs she'd bought when the children were still small enough to swing their legs and kick the table legs, without meaning to. The faded curtains she'd sewn herself on that ancient machine that always jammed on the third seam. She'd cursed at it then. She missed it now. The refrigerator door, still covered in old magnets, from places she'd never visited, but her children had. Little plastic souvenirs from lives that had grown beyond her kitchen. In the center of the fridge hung a wrinkled drawing, a house, a tree, a woman with very big hair and very long eyelashes. Underneath it, in wobbly letters, Nana. Helen smiled. Then the smile faded. She poured the boiling water over the tea bag in her favorite mug, the one with the tiny crack near the handle, the one that somehow never seemed to actually break. Just like her, she supposed. Cracked but holding. She carried it to the table and sat down in the same chair she'd occupied for decades. This kitchen had seen everything. School lunches made in a rush. Birthday cakes that leaned slightly to one side, but tasted just fine. Late-night arguments, whispered so the children wouldn't hear. Early morning apologies. Over coffee and toast, it had heard laughter, so loud the windows shook. It had heard crying, so quiet even the table pretended not to notice. And now, most nights, it heard only the gentle clink of her spoon against her mug. Helen stirred her tea slowly. She wasn't unhappy. Not exactly. She loved her children. They called when they could. They sent photos of the grandchildren, doing ordinary, wonderful things. They brought them round. On birthdays and holidays, people at church said she was strong. Neighbors said she was kind. The lady at the grocery store always asked about her knees. Her life was not empty, just quiet. She blew on her tea and watched the steam rise, almost without meaning to. She said it again. I wonder if I did all right. Her voice sounded small in the old kitchen. It surprised her, not the question itself. That had been lingering for years, like a guest who'd overstayed their welcome, but was too polite to ask to leave. But the fact that she'd actually said it, out loud, to the yellowing walls and the ticking clock and the refrigerator with its crooked magnets. I mean, she continued, then laughed at herself. Who am I even talking to? The refrigerator? But once the words had started, they didn't seem to want to stop. I tried. I really did. I got things wrong. I know I did. But I tried. She thought of all the times she'd said no. When the children had wanted something they couldn't afford. All the nights she'd stayed up sewing costumes because they'd only told her about the school play the night before. All the times she'd hidden her own worries behind a smile because someone else in the house needed the calm version of her. Her fingers curled around the mug. She wasn't asking for applause. She knew life didn't work that way. But somewhere deep inside, there was a young girl still. The girl who had once thought that if she just worked hard enough, loved hard enough, held everything together for long enough, someone would look at her one day and say, "You did well. You really did." The clock ticked. No one said anything. Helen took a sip of tea. It was then that her eye caught something on the corner of the table. A notebook. Plain, spiral-bound, the kind they sold in packs of 3. She frowned. She didn't remember leaving it there. The memories. 8 to 20. Helen pulled the notebook closer. Part of her didn't want to open it. What if she'd written down all the things she got wrong? All the mistakes? All the moments she'd failed? In ways she couldn't take back? Her hand hovered over the cover. She almost pushed it away. But then she thought, even that would be hiding. Even that would be running. And she was so tired of running from herself. She opened it. On the first page was her own handwriting from years ago. Things to remember, she had written at the top. She had no recollection of making this list. The first entry was simple. The day Anna fell off her bike and got back on again. Helen could see it immediately. Her youngest daughter, knees scraped, lower lip trembling, declaring dramatically that she would never ride again. Helen had sat with her on the front steps, cleaning the wound, listening to the storm of feelings, as if each word mattered, because it did. And then, quietly, gently, she had walked her back to the bike. "You don't have to go far," she'd said. "Just to the end of the street and back." Anna had done it. Then again, faster each time. By evening, she was flying down the sidewalk, as if she'd never fallen at all. Helen smiled now, her chest warming. She'd forgotten that she'd written it down. She'd forgotten the moment itself, until just now. How many other moments had she forgotten? The second entry. The night Mark came home late and told me the truth. Her son. Teenage years. The night he'd made a decision that could have gone very badly. He'd stood in this very kitchen, shoulders hunched, eyes red, and he'd told her everything. She had wanted to yell, wanted to make the moment big and loud, so he would never forget it. But instead, she'd made him sit at this table, poured him a glass of water, listened, really listened. And when he'd finished, voice shaking, she'd said, "Thank you for telling me. That was brave. We'll figure this out together." It hadn't fixed everything. Real life almost never wrapped up as neatly as the shows on television. But he'd stayed. He'd talked. He'd kept talking for years after that. Even now, when he called, he told her things. He didn't tell anyone else. Helen's throat tightened. She turned the page carefully, as if the paper itself might hold more than ink. Staying up all night with Mum when she forgot who I was, but still liked the sound of my voice. Her mother, the long, slow fading. The night she'd called out from her bedroom, confused and frightened, reaching for a face she no longer recognized. Helen had made tea then, too. They'd sat in this kitchen. "Who are you, dear?" Her mother had asked her, over and over, each time with fresh confusion. "It's Helen," she'd replied, each time as gently as the first. Her mother hadn't remembered the name, but she had smiled at the kindness in the voice. At dawn, her mother had finally yawned. and said, "You have a nice way about you, whoever you are." Helen had gone to bed exhausted and full at the same time. Now, sitting at the same table, years later, Helen let out a long breath. "I forgot I'd written these," she whispered. She turned another page. Blank. Another blank. The list stopped at 3. 3 memories out of thousands of days. What about all the other moments? The ones where she yelled because she was tired, so tired she couldn't see straight? The ones where she failed to show up the way she wanted to? Where she gave up? Where she looked away? Helen closed the notebook. Her hands were trembling. Maybe the problem wasn't that she couldn't remember the good. Maybe it was that she'd never believed she deserved to. She looked around the kitchen again, at the marks on the wall, where she'd measured the children's height. Every birthday, at the stain on the ceiling. From that time, the upstairs pipe had burst, and she'd handled it alone, because there was no one else to call. At the drawer that always stuck, unless you jiggled it just right. A secret handshake with her own house. This room was proof of a lived-in life, a used-up life, a life that had been poured out, and poured out, and poured out again. Not wasted, given. But to who? For what? Had it been enough? "I don't know," Helen said quietly to the empty kitchen. "I really don't know." Her voice cracked. One tear escaped before she could stop it. Then another. And then the answer. 20 to 30. She felt it. Not a sound. Not exactly a voice. More like a warmth that began at the back of her neck, slid over her shoulders, like a shawl on a winter morning, and settled gently around her heart. It felt like standing in sunlight after a long gray winter. It felt like coming home after being lost. Words formed in her mind. Soft, clear, undeniable. "You did well." Helen froze. The air didn't change. The lights didn't flicker. No angel appeared at the end of the table. But the words were as real as the wood under her elbows and the tea cooling in her cup. "You did well. You loved well. More than you know." Her breath hitched. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know if I did." The feeling didn't leave. If anything, it settled deeper. It wasn't a voice from outside. It was deeper than that. Like her bones knew something. Her mind had forgotten. Like the universe itself had been waiting for this exact moment in this exact kitchen to tell her the truth. You stayed. You showed up. You carried more than anyone saw. You kept going on days you wanted to stop. That is doing well. Helen covered her face with her hands. All the years of second-guessing herself, of lying awake at night, wondering if she had failed her children, failed her husband, failed herself. All the quiet questions she had never spoken out loud rose up in her and then, slowly, began to dissolve, like sugar in hot tea. She wasn't perfect. She'd never claimed to be. But in that old kitchen, with its faded curtains and scratched table and humming refrigerator, something inside her finally loosened, a knot she didn't know she'd been carrying. For decades, she lowered her hands. Her cheeks were wet. Her heart felt strangely light. "I did the best I could," she said aloud, testing the words. They didn't sound like an excuse. They didn't sound like defeat. They sounded like the truth. She looked at the notebook again. Maybe the list wasn't really only 3. Maybe it was hundreds, thousands of small things no one had ever written down. The nights she'd sat beside a sick child's bed, watching them breathe. The days she'd gone to work, even when her feet ached, because the bills wouldn't pay themselves. The mornings she'd chosen to be kind, instead of sharp, even when she was so tired. She could barely remember her own name. All the unseen things, all the unapplauded things. All the moments that didn't make the highlight reel, but made up the entire film. Helen pulled the notebook closer, opened it to a blank page. Her hand shook a little as she picked up a pen. On the empty line, she wrote, making sure there was always someone to come home to. She stared at the words. They were simple, plain, but something about them made her chest ache, in a good way. She turned to the next page, not giving up on myself, even when I wanted to. The pen moved more easily now, loving people who didn't always know how to love me back, saying yes when I was scared, saying no when I was tired, getting up every single morning, and choosing to try again. She paused. A soft laugh escaped her. If I keep going, she said to the kitchen, I might need a bigger notebook. The clock ticked on. The kettle, long forgotten, sat quiet on the stove. Helen closed the notebook gently. The earlier warmth was still there. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady, like a hand on her back, as she climbed the last few steps of a long staircase. You did well. The feeling seemed to say again, you are doing well, even now. She reached for her tea. It had cooled, but she drank it anyway. She felt proud. It wasn't a loud pride. No one else would have noticed it if they'd walked in just then. But inside, quietly, she stood a little taller. I did all right, she said softly. Then a little stronger. I did well. The old kitchen seemed to glow, just a bit warmer, in the lamplight. She could almost imagine the room itself nodding. Yes, you did. Helen stayed there a while longer, just breathing, remembering not only the mistakes, not only the regrets, but the ordinary courage of showing up day after day after day, the heroism of making breakfast, the bravery of doing laundry, the strength of staying. At last, she pushed her chair back. The familiar creak greeted her. Like an old friend, she put the notebook in the middle of the table instead of hiding it away. Maybe tomorrow, she would write more. Maybe she would call her daughter and tell her about the bike. Maybe she would tell her son that his honesty that night had meant more than he knew. Maybe she would even tell them that she was proud of herself, not for being perfect, but for being there. She turned off the small lamp. The kitchen slipped into shadow, but it didn't feel empty. As she walked down the hallway toward her bedroom, Helen carried with her a quiet sentence. She knew she wouldn't forget again. I did well. And for the first time in a long time, she believed it. Helen didn't become a different person that night. Her knees still hurt. Her children still lived far away. The kitchen was still old, but something had shifted. Not the world. Her. She had given herself what she'd been waiting for others to give. Permission to be proud. Closing. 29 to 31. If you are listening to this, in your own quiet kitchen, or bedroom, or favorite chair, and some part of you wonders if you did enough, hear this. You showed up. You kept going. You loved in the ways you could, with what you had, in the time you were given. That matters. The small things you think no one noticed, someone noticed. The days you think you failed, you were still there. That counts. The moments you kept going, when everything in you wanted to stop, that is courage. That is strength. That is enough. You have done well to come this far. And that is not a small thing. You did well. You are doing well, even now.